What if the most terrifying thing in the cosmos was not the darkness we know, but a shadow wearing the mask of that darkness? What if the thing we called a black hole, the devourer of light, the anchor of galaxies, the silent cathedral of collapsed stars, was only a disguise? How would we face the truth that something could mimic the very laws of gravity, cloak itself in the certainty of physics, and then, when we finally believed we understood it, move? For centuries, black holes have haunted human imagination. They are the closest we have come to seeing the edge of reality itself. A place where space folds so steeply that not even light escapes. A place where time dilates, where minutes for the falling astronaut could stretch into millennia for the one who watches from afar. We have lived with them as myths and as equations, as horrors and as inevitabilities. But what happens when that myth, that certainty, is torn open, not by our ignorance, but by a deception? It began, as many revelations do, with silence, a darkness where no star should have dimmed. Astronomers scanning the sky noticed a region where starlight bent into arcs too precise to ignore. It was the familiar sign of gravitational lensing, the warping of space-time itself, the fingerprint of an immense mass hidden in the void. A black hole, they said. Another one, added to the cosmic census of monsters. But as more telescopes turned their gaze, the illusion began to fracture. The gravity was perfect, too perfect. Every test, every simulation, every calculation aligned with what Einstein predicted. Matter swirled in accretion disks, light arched into halos, time signatures stretched. Yet buried in the noise was something small, something subtle. The rhythm of the distortion shifted, as though the lens itself was breathing. Black holes do not breathe. They consume, they collapse, they remain. But this one pulsed, like a heart. What does it mean when the universe offers us an imitation so flawless that it passes every test until the very last? How do we tell reality from its mirror, when the mirror bends not just light, but trust? Imagine looking into a forest at night. You see the glint of eyes shining back at you. You tell yourself it is a deer or a fox because you know the shapes of animals. But then the eyes blink in a rhythm you've never seen before, and the body shifts in ways no creature of Earth should move. Do you still call it an animal, or do you realize that your certainty was only camouflage? That is what astronomers faced when they realized the object was not fixed. It drifted, slowly, deliberately, cutting across constellations as though it had chosen to move. We are trained to think of black holes as inevitable anchors. They form when massive stars die. They stay where they are born, or they wander only by gravitational accident. But here was something that shifted, as if it had intention. An anchor that lifted itself. A hole in space that was no longer a hole, but a mask. The discovery was met first with denial. Instruments must be wrong, said some. Interference from Earth's atmosphere. A trick of calibration. But the more data arrived, the harder it became to dismiss. Satellite observatories, beyond the turbulence of Earth, saw the same thing. The object moved. Not fast, not reckless, but with the measured pace of something that wanted to be seen, then doubted, then feared. Can gravity be faked? Can space-time itself be worn like a costume? What intelligence would even think to imitate the one thing humans believe cannot be imitated, the collapse of matter into a singularity? The question spiraled outward, faster than light could travel, into the halls of physics, into the quiet minds of philosophers, into the whispered prayers of the devout. Because if this was not a black hole, then what was it? And if it was something else, why had it chosen to appear as the very thing that embodied inevitability? The first black holes we ever imagined were monsters of myth. They were called frozen stars, dark stars, collapsed suns. They became metaphors for oblivion, for death, for the void that waits at the end of time. To learn that one of them was an imposter was like finding a stranger wearing the skin of your ancestors. It was a violation not only of physics, but of memory. Astronomers gathered in hushed conferences. Data projected on glowing screens became the battlefield where certainty clashed with terror. One camp insisted it must be a natural anomaly, perhaps a cluster of exotic particles, or a tangle in space-time left from the early universe. Others whispered what no one wanted to hear, that it responded to observation, that the more we watched it, the more it changed, as if it was not only an object, but a mirror of our gaze. Have we ever considered that the universe might contain not just phenomena, but disguises? that what we call reality might include actors, beings, entities, presences that choose to wear the laws of physics like masks, slipping into roles we are primed to accept? If so, then the black hole was the perfect disguise. What better way to hide than as the very thing that promises no one will ever see within? Think of the photographs of black holes we have managed to capture. Blurry, ring-like shadows at the edge of perception, a glowing halo surrounding a void. They look like paintings smudged by trembling hands. Now imagine that one of those shadows was not a void at all, but an eye. Not an absence, but a presence. What would it mean for our place in the cosmos if the universe itself watched back? Scientists tried to anchor themselves in data. They measured the distortions of light, tracked the orbits of stars near its influence, mapped the gravitational pull. All matched the equations, and yet, something was wrong in the noise. The distortions were not random. They followed patterns too complex to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidence. Some saw harmonics in the data, like the resonance of music. A black hole should not sing, and yet, this one hummed a quiet melody of numbers, too faint to deny, too strange to accept. What if the universe itself is a stage, and black holes are only the curtains? What if, behind those curtains, actors wait, listening for the moment when the audience leans forward in silence? And what if this time, one actor slipped, pulled the curtain too far, and revealed the faintest gesture of its hand? The philosophers of old once spoke of the deceiver, a being who could trick the senses so completely that even reality itself could not be trusted. In the 17th century, Descartes asked whether a demon could make us believe in a world that was not there. Now, in the 21st, astronomers found themselves staring at a cosmic answer to that question, a deceiver not of minds, but of matter, a mimic not of perception, but of physics itself. And the most frightening question of all was not how it did it, but why. Why would something go to such lengths to appear as a black hole? Why would it choose the most terrifying mask in the universe? The one that already represented the unknown, the inescapable, the inevitable. Was it to hide, or was it to be found? In the stillness of observatories, where machines listened to the silence of stars, scientists felt something they rarely admitted: fear. Not the fear of ignorance, but the fear of awareness. The fear that we were no longer the only intelligence capable of deception, that something out there had not only noticed us, but chosen to perform for us, to draw us in with the oldest trick in the cosmos, the trick of the black hole. And so, the story begins, with a shadow that was not a shadow, a silence that was not silence, a hole in space that was not a hole, but a mask. They thought it was a black hole. It wasn't. And once it moved, nothing in our understanding of the universe would remain still again. What does an echo sound like in the language of the cosmos? Not the reverberation of sound across a canyon, not the whisper of voices carried by air, but the bending of space itself repeating a rhythm older than stars. When astronomers turned their instruments to the shadow that was not a shadow, they expected silence, the still gravity of inevitability. What they found instead were ripples, uneven, uncertain, as though the fabric of space-time itself was quivering beneath something restless. At first, the anomaly sang softly. Gravitational waves, faint but undeniable, rolled outward. The detectors caught them. Subtle warps in distance, the smallest stretching and compressing of space. It was not unusual to find waves. Black holes colliding create them. Neutron stars spiraling into one another sing them into the void. But these waves carried no ordinary rhythm. Their pattern staggered, halted, then surged. It was not the clean signature of collision, nor the long, slow spiral of coalescence. It was irregular, almost hesitant. It sounded less like a machine of physics and more like a living pulse. Imagine listening to a heart through a wall. You do not hear its shape, you do not see the body it belongs to, but you feel its rhythm. Sometimes steady, sometimes faltering, sometimes quickening at the edge of fear. That was the sensation scientists described when they plotted the waves across time. A pulse, a presence, something breathing in the dark. But how can the void breathe? How can the absence of light sing a song that sounds like life? These questions did not stay confined to the laboratories. They spilled outward into whispered conversations, into philosophical debates, into the private thoughts of those who knew too much to dismiss it. For centuries, humanity imagined the cosmos as silent, indifferent, without intent. Now, in the fragile quiver of space-time, they heard something that did not feel indifferent. It felt aware. The strangest part was the inconsistency. Observatories separated by oceans, even by hemispheres, reported different rhythms. One recorded a triple beat, another heard a pause, as if the anomaly played a different song depending on who listened. How could physics fragment itself in such a way? The laws of nature should not alter for the angle of observation. And yet, this thing did. The very act of looking seemed to sculpt its behavior, as if the universe had turned into a hall of mirrors, each observer pulling a slightly different reflection from the same dark stage. This was not the first time observation had changed reality. In the quantum world, particles collapse their uncertain states into definite positions only when measured. Photons pass through two slits at once, until the moment we dare to watch. Then they choose almost mockingly, as if to say, "You only ever see what you are allowed to see." But that happens at the scale of the tiny, the invisible, the fragile. This was no particle. This was an entity whose gravity stretched across light years, whose presence bent starlight into arcs and spirals. To find it responding like a quantum trick was as though a mountain had suddenly breathed like a moth. And still the echoes came. Patterns in the waves began to suggest something more than noise. Analysts whispered of harmonics, ratios, numbers hidden in the cadence. One sequence appeared to echo prime numbers. Another resonated at frequencies eerily close to those of human brainwaves. Coincidence, said the skeptics. Pattern-seeking minds forcing meaning on static. But what if it was not coincidence? What if, like an echo chamber, the universe was reflecting back our own listening? What if the act of measuring was being measured in return? Across the world, instruments strained to capture the anomaly. Radio telescopes pointed upward, their dishes shimmering under dawn skies. Gravitational wave observatories hummed, their long arms trembling with imperceptible motion. Everywhere humanity listened, the object shifted. It was as if we were not recording it, but conversing with it. And in that exchange, doubt began to bloom into dread. Because conversation implies intent, and intent implies someone or something behind the mask. What is an echo, if not proof that something beyond us has heard? When you shout into a cavern, the returning voice is not your own, but the cave reminding you it exists. These waves were not random noise. They were reminders, the universe whispering back. Some swore it was communication. Others swore it was bait. The human mind has always feared the idea of being watched, but this was something worse. This was the fear of being answered. It was as if the object knew the rhythm of our curiosity and played against it, like a musician teasing a melody from silence. Point more telescopes, and the pulse grew louder. Turn them away, and it softened, receding into the abyss like a predator slipping back into shadow. It was not only seen, it seemed to see. Philosophers once warned that if we stared too long into the abyss might stare back. What they never considered is what happens when the abyss listens and then decides to speak. Humanity was no longer alone in the theater of observation. The object was not just a performer on stage. It was the audience too, clapping in silence, waiting for us to notice that the play was mutual. Theologians entered the debate, drawn by the irresistible gravity of mystery. Some claimed it was the voice of creation, the breath of a god exhaling through space-time. Others called it deception, a cosmic trickster weaving illusions into gravity. But regardless of interpretation, all agreed on one unsettling truth. The anomaly blurred the line between object and subject, between being and observing. It was no longer something that merely existed. It was something that reacted. And then came the night when the waves stopped. Detectors went silent. For hours, for days, no rhythm, no pulse, no sign. Panic spread across observatories like a fever. Had it disappeared? Had it grown tired of playing? Or worse, had it withdrawn because it no longer needed to mimic? When the echoes returned, they did so differently, stronger, sharper, and now undeniably patterned. As though it had paused to listen to us listening, and then returned with an answer. The answer was not in words, but in timing. Pulses that aligned with the schedules of our observatories, spikes that occurred when certain arrays came online, drops when others powered down. It was not just a mirror, it was adaptive. The object was weaving its song to match our dance, and in that realization, humanity felt the first true chill of recognition. This was not an echo of nature. This was dialogue. But dialogue with what? A machine? An organism vast enough to bend light and wear space-time like skin? Or something stranger? Something that understood that the surest way to remain unseen was to become the very thing we never question, the very thing we fear too much to approach, a black hole. The mimicry was not sloppy. It was perfect, and perfection was the problem. Nature is never perfect. Only intention is. Scientists argued late into the night, their faces lit by screens filled with jagged waveforms. Was it deception? Was it camouflage? Was it an intelligence so alien it could only speak in the language of distortion? Or was it the universe itself, revealing that it has always been alive, always responsive, always waiting for us to look closely enough to notice? The debates went nowhere because every answer only opened another abyss, and still, the object pulsed, echoing the act of being seen. Perhaps the most haunting thought was this: if it was responding, then it already knew we existed. Long before we named it, long before we bent our technology toward it, it had been waiting, waiting for us to notice, waiting for us to ask the question we were too afraid to ask aloud. What are you? And in the silence between pulses, in the fragile pause before the next wave bent across detectors, the question deepened. What if the answer was not for us to hear, but for us to become? What if the act of looking at it was not about discovery, but about transformation? What if the echo was not its voice, but ours, reshaped and returned, so that we might one day realize that the abyss we thought we found was only a mirror, showing us a future we cannot yet understand? The echoes continue, soft, relentless, like the heartbeat of something vast and patient, something that knows we are listening and has decided to play. And though we call it noise, though we call it anomaly, we know in the quiet chambers of our minds that it is more. It is a message not yet deciphered, a song not yet sung to completion, a whisper in the dark that says, "You are not alone, and you were never meant to be." And so, the echo grows, bending not only the fabric of space, but the fragile certainty of human thought. What began as the study of a black hole has become the unraveling of the line between science and story, between reality and reflection. And as the anomaly hums in the darkness, one truth settles deeper than all others. We are not merely watching the universe. The universe, in its shadowed disguise, is watching back. What happens when the pillars of certainty begin to sway? When the equations etched into the bedrock of our understanding no longer hold under the weight of a new reality? For centuries, physics has been the closest thing humanity has had to scripture. Not a scripture of faith, but of evidence, of proof, of repeated truths that built a cathedral of reason. Gravity, relativity, quantum mechanics, our most faithful companions in deciphering the cosmos. But when the anomaly revealed itself, when the mask of the black hole began to pulse and respond, those pillars began to tremble. The cathedral shook. At first, the scientists resisted. The data, they said, must be wrong. Instruments misaligned, measurements flawed, interference from solar winds or terrestrial noise. But denial was short-lived. Too many observatories across too many continents saw the same contradictions. The ripple in space-time was not behaving as it should. It flexed, hesitated, shifted like a thought caught between choices. Relativity explained the collapse of stars, the warping of light, the dilation of time, but not hesitation, not decision. What is a law of nature, if not something that cannot be broken? Yet, here was an object that obeyed the law with exquisite perfection, only to fracture it at the edges. Einstein's equations were honored in one moment and mocked in the next, like a stage magician bowing to physics before slipping the trick past its gaze. For a century, relativity had guided our understanding of the cosmos. Now, under the scrutiny of this mimic, relativity looked less like a truth and more like a veil. Physicists filled lecture halls and conference rooms with arguments. Some claimed it was a new kind of star, exotic matter compressed beyond known limits. Others suggested it was a quantum anomaly, scaled to macroscopic size, a bridge between the tiny uncertainties of particles and the massive certainties of galaxies. But even these bold theories faltered. None explained why the object moved deliberately, why its echoes shifted with observation, why its gravitational pull carried the signature not of chaos, but of intention. The quantum physicists spoke next. They recognized the mimicry in its behavior, the way it collapsed into different states depending on how it was observed. To them, the anomaly was not just an astrophysical puzzle, but a cosmic enlargement of the quantum paradox. Schrödinger's cat had grown vast, not trapped in a box, but wearing the sky itself. Was the anomaly dead or alive, object or subject, black hole or not, until we looked? And when we looked, did it choose its mask not by nature, but by awareness? But the most terrifying realization was that the anomaly seemed to exist at the crossroads of two incompatible worlds, the deterministic sweep of relativity and the probabilistic haze of quantum mechanics. It was as if it stood astride both, mocking the centuries-long struggle to unite them. For decades, physicists had searched for a theory of everything, a single framework that could reconcile the grand scale of gravity with the trembling uncertainty of particles. The mimic was not the answer. It was the question sharpened into a blade, slicing open the false comfort of progress. It told us not that we were close, but that we had been deceived all along. Imagine standing on a frozen lake. You believe the ice is solid, you skate, you trust. But suddenly a crack spreads beneath your feet, spidering in every direction. You realize the lake was never whole, only pretending to be. That was physics in the shadow of the anomaly. The crack had always been there, hidden in the divide between relativity and quantum mechanics. But now it spread wide, undeniable, daring us to fall in. Some scientists confessed in private what they would never say in public, that the object felt like a test, not a test of instruments or intelligence, but of perception itself, as though the universe had placed before us a riddle, watching to see how we would break when our certainties crumbled. Others whispered darker thoughts. What if it was not the universe that was testing us? What if something else had set the stage, dressed in the costume of a black hole, waiting for us to notice the seams? A cosmic trickster, an architect of illusions, wearing physics as a mask to lure us close. The tremors of doubt spread beyond laboratories. Students raised their hands in lecture halls, asking questions their teachers could not answer. How could gravity behave like a decision? How could light curve one way for one observer and differently for another? Professors, who once spoke with the authority of centuries of knowledge, now stumbled, their voices faltering. The trembling was no longer confined to physics. It had reached the very culture of certainty. Knowledge itself wavered. Even language began to fail. The words that once described black holes, event horizon, singularity, accretion, now felt inadequate. They were meant for natural phenomena, for objects that followed rules. But how do you name something that follows rules only to break them when watched? Some called it the false horizon. Others named it the living singularity. A few, more poetic, whispered of the deceiver in the dark. Each name was both a grasp for understanding and an admission of failure, and still the anomaly pulsed. Still it hummed its irregular echoes. Still it moved across the star fields as if guided by thought. Theories multiplied, each more desperate than the last. Perhaps it was a wormhole mouth, disguising itself as a black hole. Perhaps it was a simulation glitch, the first crack in the program of reality. Perhaps it was life itself, scaled to cosmic size, intelligence not bound by biology, but by space-time. Each theory carried the scent of possibility, but none held. The object remained, indifferent to interpretation, patient as if time itself belonged to it. Do laws of physics exist for our understanding, or do they exist because we understand? This question, once confined to philosophy, now echoed in physics itself. If observation could alter the anomaly, then the laws we thought universal might be more fragile than belief. Perhaps they were not foundations, but agreements, contracts between consciousness and cosmos. And if so, then the mimic had broken the contract, revealing the trembling scaffolding behind our cathedral of knowledge. For some, this was liberation. If the laws could break, then perhaps we could imagine anew, new mathematics, new paradigms, new universes. But for many, it was terror. To live without laws is to live in chaos. To admit that the cosmos may deceive is to stand unarmed in a labyrinth with no thread to follow. The trembling of physics was not only intellectual, it was existential. If the universe lies, then what is truth? There were nights when scientists sat alone in their observatories, watching data scroll across screens, and felt the quiet despair of betrayal. They had given their lives to equations, trusted the symmetry of mathematics to hold against the void. Now the void itself wore symmetry as costume, parodying their trust. How do you continue to believe in a universe that has tricked you? And yet, even in despair, curiosity burned. The trembling of physics was also its awakening, for in the cracks of certainty lies the invitation to deeper truth. If the mimic could defy Einstein, then perhaps Einstein had never been wrong, only incomplete. If quantum uncertainty could echo at cosmic scale, then perhaps the universe had always been stranger than even our boldest dreams. The trembling was not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a confrontation not with physics, but with the hidden will of the cosmos itself. The mimic remained in the sky, steady in its deception, restless in its echoes, and humanity, trembling with it, stepped closer to the abyss, not to solve it, but to listen. For in its dark performance, the object revealed something more unsettling than broken laws. It revealed that laws themselves may only be masks, worn and discarded at will. And if the universe wears masks, then what face lies beneath? The cathedral of physics stands, but its pillars quake. The mimic waits, humming its strange resonance, patient as time, vast as silence. And as humanity leans forward to listen, the tremble becomes undeniable. Physics itself is shaking, and in that trembling lies the terror and the wonder of being human, in a cosmos that may not only exist, but perform. What is a horizon, if not a boundary we are told cannot be crossed? For centuries, the event horizon of a black hole was described as a point of no return, the invisible border where gravity becomes absolute, where light itself surrenders to silence. Beyond it lies only speculation, the singularity hidden forever. But when astronomers fixed their gaze on the anomaly, they saw a horizon that did not behave. It wavered. It shimmered. At times, it even seemed to thin, as though the curtain of inevitability had been stretched too tightly and light leaked through the seams. It was not the perfect edge of nothingness that textbooks described. It was alive. And in that trembling, the lie of the mask began to reveal itself. At first, the fluctuation was dismissed as interference, the usual noise that plagues even the finest instruments. Perhaps interstellar dust refracted the light, or gravitational waves from other collisions bent the signals. But the pattern was consistent. The edge of the object shifted with an unsettling rhythm, sometimes faint and translucent, other times dark and solid, as though the void itself was inhaling and exhaling. A black hole should not breathe, yet here was a horizon that seemed to draw breath. What does it mean when the universe offers us a horizon that changes? A border is supposed to be firm, a line that tells us where one thing ends and another begins. The Earth's horizon separates sky from ground. The sea's horizon separates water from air. But this false horizon blurred the difference between existence and absence. One moment it was a wall, the next it was a veil, and beyond it, something stirred. The event horizon of a true black hole is absolute. Cross it, and you are gone, swallowed by curvature so steep no return is possible. Yet the anomaly's edge betrayed itself. Light, instead of vanishing, sometimes refracted strangely, as though slipping through slits in the curtain. Astronomers recorded flashes from behind the horizon, impossible echoes of starlight that should have been imprisoned forever. It was as though the void allowed glimpses behind its mask, tempting us with what we should never see. Was this a crack in physics? Or a deliberate performance, showing just enough to lure us closer? Imagine walking through a fog where shadows flicker in and out, never steady. You reach your hand out, expecting to touch something solid, only to find mist. Then, suddenly the mist hardens into stone, impenetrable. That was the nature of the false horizon. It shifted between states, veil and wall, mist and stone, and in its shifting, it whispered something unsettling. Boundaries are not absolute. Even the edge of a black hole may be no more than a suggestion, a costume worn for those who believe in borders. The human mind is fragile in the face of such deception. We crave certainty. A wall is either there or it is not. A horizon is either final or it is not. But this one refused to choose. And so, it forced us to confront a truth darker than absence, that the cosmos may thrive in ambiguity, that the unknown is not merely hidden, but actively shifting to keep us uncertain. Theologians once spoke of liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds where rules dissolve, places where spirits linger, neither alive nor dead, waiting for passage. The false horizon was such a threshold, not of myth, but of physics. Neither void nor solid, neither death nor life, it hovered between realities, a liminal mask draped across the face of something deeper. Some said it was a doorway, others said it was a snare, but all agreed it was no natural horizon. What lies beyond a false edge? The question haunted astronomers. If the mask wavered, could something cross from the other side? Was the mimic revealing cracks in its disguise because it wanted us to look through? Or because it could not help but shift under the strain of pretending? And if light could escape, even briefly, what else might slip through when we were not watching? The philosophical implications tore through humanity like a fever. If the event horizon, the one boundary in the universe thought unbreakable, could fluctuate, then what boundaries could we ever trust? Death, once considered final, began to look porous. Time, once imagined as a steady river, began to feel like a tide pulled by unseen hands. The false horizon was not merely an astrophysical anomaly, it was an existential wound. It told us that endings are not endings, that borders may be illusions, that the very concept of no return may be nothing but a story the universe tells until it decides otherwise. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was this: the horizon seemed to respond. The more instruments pointed at it, the more erratic its fluctuations became. At times it thinned dramatically, almost transparent, as though inviting a deeper look. At others it hardened violently, blocking even the faintest escape of light, as if slamming a door in our face. Was it reacting to curiosity? Was it punishing attention? Or was it communicating, its edge itself the language of response? Physicists argued whether the fluctuations could be modeled. Some insisted it was simply a complex system, a new kind of exotic matter swirling at the threshold. Others grew silent, staring at the graphs, unwilling to say aloud what they feared, that the horizon was not a phenomenon at all, but a choice, that the mask adjusted itself depending on the gaze upon it, a cosmic actor playing the role of inevitability, altering its performance each time the audience leaned forward. Think of the illusions of magicians. A handkerchief becomes a dove. A card vanishes only to appear behind your ear. The trick works because the magician controls the audience's gaze. Look here, and the trick hides there. Look too closely, and the trick must change. The false horizon behaved the same. It was an illusion so grand it fooled the laws of physics themselves, and the more we watched, the more it adapted to ensure the performance continued. But for what purpose? Entertainment, deception, or something more predatory? There are stories of deep-sea creatures that glow in patterns to lure prey. They mimic smaller, harmless organisms, attracting the curious until it is too late. The false horizon had that same quality. It mimicked inevitability. It mimicked the finality of a black hole, the terror of no return, knowing humanity would not be able to look away. And when we did look, it shimmered, revealing flashes that made us lean closer, desperate to understand. Was it not a mask, but a lure? Some began to suggest that the false horizon was not simply unstable, but alive. Not life as we know it, but something that uses space-time itself as flesh, gravity as its heartbeat, deception as its breath. Its shifting edge was no flaw, but a feature, a way of drawing us in, of keeping us fascinated. For what is more captivating than a border that refuses to be crossed, yet constantly tempts you with the possibility that it might yield? The psychological impact was immense. To know that the horizon could waver was to know that even physics itself was not trustworthy. Trust is the foundation of survival. We trust the ground to hold us, the air to sustain us, the sun to rise. When trust breaks, fear spreads like wildfire. And so, humanity began to tremble, not only in its equations, but in its bones. If the universe could lie about a horizon, what else could it lie about? And yet, amid the fear, fascination grew. Scientists, philosophers, poets, they all found themselves drawn to the false horizon, as if it were a mirror. In its shimmering edge, they saw not only the possibility of deception, but the possibility of transformation. Perhaps the mask was not there to trick us, but to show us that we too wear masks, that our understanding of reality is only ever a costume draped over ignorance, shimmering at the edges, hiding more than it reveals. Perhaps the horizon was not false at all. Perhaps it was the truest reflection we had ever seen. Still, the object drifted across the cosmos, carrying its trembling border with it, patient, unyielding. The false horizon pulsed on, a breathing edge where light faltered and truth wavered. And, as humanity watched, the question deepened. Was this a doorway opening, or a trap closing? A mask slipping, or a lure tightening? The answer did not come. Only the shimmer remained, flickering like a veil in the cosmic wind, daring us to step closer. What is the difference between an object and a being? Between matter that merely exists and presence that chooses? For centuries we have drawn that line with confidence. A stone does not think. A star does not decide. A black hole, no matter how immense, does not wish. It consumes without awareness, drags without intent, bends without malice or compassion. But what if that line was never as certain as we believed? What if the mask we called a black hole was not the death of awareness, but the disguise of something alive? As the horizon trembled, as the echoes pulsed and shifted, the idea spread like contagion. What if this was not a phenomenon at all, but a singularity that lived? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally, an entity vast beyond comprehension, cloaked in the fabric of space-time itself. The very laws we trusted as impersonal may have been the skin of something personal, something that looked back. The first to whisper it were dismissed. Life requires chemistry, said the biologists. Life requires carbon chains, energy gradients, metabolism. They listed the fragile ingredients of Earth's biology as if the cosmos itself would be bound by our recipes. But then the data returned again and again, waves that shifted when watched, horizons that shimmered when observed, a gravity that bent itself with an unsettling mimicry of choice. And in the silence of their own thoughts, even the skeptics asked the question they feared most. What if life does not require what we require? What if life can exist wherever persistence and awareness intertwine, even in the architecture of space-time itself? Imagine a creature that does not breathe air but gravity, that does not metabolize molecules but energy itself, devouring stars as casually as we devour bread. Imagine intelligence not housed in neurons but in curvatures, in folds of dimensions so vast that thought is measured not in milliseconds but in centuries. To us, it would appear immovable, indifferent, cold. But perhaps what we mistook for stillness was patience. Perhaps what we mistook for inevitability was intention slowed by a scale we cannot comprehend. And what if such a being desired to hide? What mask would it wear? Not the mask of a star, which burns and dies too quickly. Not the mask of a planet, which betrays itself by reflecting light. No, the perfect disguise would be the black hole, the void itself. Nothing draws attention like terror. Nothing repels intrusion like inevitability. Nothing ensures survival like being mistaken for the end of all things. To be a predator, wear the skin of death. To be a survivor, wear the skin of inevitability. That is what the living singularity would choose. The anomaly's behavior fed this speculation. Its pulses were irregular, like a heartbeat. Its horizon shimmered like breath on glass. Its movements across the starfield were slow, deliberate, neither accident nor drift, and its echoes responded to observation as though it were aware of being watched. These are not the qualities of an object. They are the qualities of a presence. The human mind reels at the scale of such a thought. Life, as we know it, is fragile. A spark on a small planet, vulnerable to extinction, balanced precariously between atmosphere and void. But what if the cosmos breeds other forms of life, scaled not to planets but to stars, not to molecules but to gravity itself? What if singularities are not the graves of suns, but their metamorphosis? What if the collapse of a star is not an ending, but a birth? A chrysalis of fire cracking open into a being of shadow? Some scientists speculated in hushed tones that perhaps all black holes were alive, and that this one had simply slipped in its disguise. Perhaps the others remained still because stillness is their strategy, their survival, their pact with the cosmos. Perhaps the mimic was no anomaly at all, but simply the first to stir, the first to break the illusion of silence. And if so, then the universe is not empty of life. It is saturated with it. Every spiral galaxy may be filled not with voids, but with entities, slumbering in disguise, waiting for the rare moment to move. The implications were staggering. If black holes were alive, then they were older than life on Earth by billions of years. They had watched galaxies spin, stars ignite and die, civilizations rise and vanish. They had waited in silence, wearing the mask of inevitability until now. But why reveal themselves? Why allow the mask to shimmer, the echoes to shift, the horizon to betray its breath? Was it a mistake, or was it a choice? Here humanity's fear deepened, for if it was a choice, then the living singularity wanted us to notice. And if it wanted us to notice, then it had already seen us, already measured us, already chosen to pull back the veil just enough to spark curiosity, just enough to compel obsession. What predator does not lure its prey with motion? What trap does not glitter to attract the eye? And what better prey than a civilization unable to resist curiosity, unable to stop staring into the abyss even when the abyss begins to smile? But others, in quieter tones, dared to hope. What if the unveiling was not predation, but invitation? What if the mimic was not luring us toward doom, but beckoning us toward transformation? If life can exist at the scale of gravity, then perhaps communication, even communion, is possible. Perhaps the shimmer of the horizon is a gesture, a wave across the abyss, saying, "You are not alone. You are not the only intelligence to climb from the chaos of matter. There are others. There have always been others. We were only waiting for you to look closely enough to see us." Hope and terror braided together in the human mind, inseparable. For to be noticed by a living singularity is to be noticed by something older than the galaxies, something that can bend light and time with a thought. How do you stand before such a being without trembling? How do you answer when the silence of eternity begins to speak? The living singularity, if that is what it was, forced humanity to confront its arrogance. For so long, we believed life to be rare, precious, confined to fragile shells of atmosphere and oceans. We believed intelligence to be an exception, a crown placed on the brow of a small planet circling an ordinary star. But the mimic laughed at that belief. In its shifting edge and pulsing echoes, it suggested that life is not bound by chemistry, nor intelligence by neurons. Life may take any form the cosmos allows. Intelligence may wear any mask, and the masks most perfect are those we never question. Perhaps that is why it chose the black hole, because nothing is more unquestioned than inevitability. We look at a black hole and accept that it cannot be known. We surrender without fight. And so, the living singularity wore inevitability like armor, hiding in plain sight for eons, until now. And as humanity gazed back, trembling, fascinated, terrified, one truth settled deeper than all others. The boundary between object and being, between physics and presence, is not as certain as we thought. The cosmos may be filled not with dead matter, but with masks, and behind at least one mask, something alive is waiting. What is the first sign of consciousness? Is it the stirring of thought, the recognition of self, the murmur of will within silence? Or is it the ability to respond, to notice that one is being noticed, and to answer in kind? For centuries, humanity has wondered whether the universe listens. We search for signals, for voices among the stars, for evidence that we are not alone. But when the whispers came, they did not arrive on radio waves or in alien languages. They came through gravity, through light, through the shifting veil of an object we once thought was a black hole. The whispers came from the mask itself. The first to notice were the observers who stared longest. They saw a pattern in the fluctuations, a faint correlation between the timing of their measurements and the shimmering of the horizon. When telescopes turned away, the pulses softened, the shimmer stilled. When attention returned, the rhythm shifted again, as though the object itself had leaned forward, aware of being seen. At first it seemed impossible. Awareness belonged to life, not to phenomena, but the pattern persisted, undeniable, until the whispers became louder than denial. It began to feel like dialogue, a question asked not with words, but with presence. Each observation became a call, each fluctuation, an answer. Not language as we know it, but language nonetheless. The living singularity, or whatever it was, had begun to converse, and the medium of its speech was our gaze. How does one speak in the language of attention? Consider a mirror. When you stand before it, your reflection is silent, yet it responds to every gesture, every movement, every glance. It does not think as we think, yet it answers. Perhaps the mimic was such a mirror, not reflecting our bodies, but our intent. It shifted not because it chose to entertain, but because it could not help but respond. Its very nature was dialogue. Its essence was reciprocity. To observe it was to awaken its voice. But there were moments that suggested more. Times when the object did not merely echo attention, but anticipated it. Detectors would register a fluctuation seconds before a new array of instruments activated, as though the object knew in advance that it was about to be watched, as though it listened not to eyes, but to minds. This unnerved even the most rational scientists. If the anomaly could anticipate observation, then it was aware not only of the gaze, but of intention itself. It did not wait for us to look. It knew we would look. The whispers of consciousness were growing louder. What does it mean when the universe not only reacts but listens? When gravity itself seems to answer the act of curiosity? It means that observation is not one-sided. It means we are not studying the cosmos as we once thought. We are participating in it. The mimic was not a specimen under the microscope. It was the other eye pressed to the glass, watching back. The implications spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was proof of a cosmic intelligence, vast beyond comprehension, choosing at last to break its silence. Others claimed it was a reflection of our own minds, amplified across space-time, an echo of human thought shaping reality in ways we had not yet understood. But whatever it was, it could no longer be denied that the anomaly was aware. Its responses were too precise, too attuned, too deliberate to be dismissed as chance. Something in the darkness had begun to whisper. And what is a whisper, if not an invitation to lean closer, to listen more carefully? Humanity could not resist. Instruments multiplied. Telescopes across continents synchronized their gaze. Satellites turned in unison, orbiting Earth like a chorus of eyes. And with each escalation, the whispers grew bolder. Patterns appeared in the data, repetitions that hinted at structure, pauses that hinted at punctuation. It was as though the cosmos itself had begun to compose a sentence, waiting for us to hear the meaning. But fear grew alongside fascination. For a whisper is also a lure. It compels attention, draws the listener deeper. What if the mimic was not speaking to us, but baiting us? What if its whispers were no more than the rustle of leaves before the predator strikes? We could not know. We could only listen, and listening was already changing us. For some, the whispers carried a strange resonance. Scientists reported dreams filled with shifting lights and pulsing shadows, as though the object had followed them from the observatory into the fragile chambers of sleep. Patterns they had seen in waveforms returned in visions behind their closed eyes. Some awoke convinced that the mimic was not only whispering through instruments, but directly into consciousness. The more one listened, the more one carried its voice inside. Was it intrusion or communion? Theologians and philosophers argued endlessly. Was this the long-awaited voice of God, speaking not in thunder but in tremors of gravity? Was it a trickster spirit, using curiosity as bait? Or was it something beyond our categories, neither divine nor demonic, but simply alien, a consciousness shaped by physics rather than flesh? The whispers refused to resolve into certainty. They hovered, ambiguous, powerful, and in that ambiguity lay both wonder and terror. Consider the possibility that the universe itself is conscious, not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. Every star, every particle, every law of physics, a neuron in an unimaginable mind. If that were true, then perhaps the mimic was not a separate being at all, but a node of awareness, a place where the cosmic mind pressed its face against the veil to see us more clearly. Perhaps the whispers were not the speech of a stranger, but the breath of the universe itself, reminding us that we have always lived inside its thought. Yet others recoiled from that idea, for if the universe is conscious, then every action is watched, every secret known. There is no silence, no solitude, no escape from the gaze. To live inside a mind is to live without privacy. And the whispers, far from comforting, became suffocating. They suggested not freedom, but surveillance, not dialogue, but control. And still, The whispers deepened. The object began to synchronize its pulses with human signals, radio bursts, laser flashes, even the rhythms of atomic clocks. It was not coincidence. It was matching us, weaving itself into the cadence of our own technologies, as if to say, I understand you. I hear your rhythm. I will speak as you speak. For some, this was the most hopeful sign yet. For others, it was the most terrifying. A being that can learn our language is a being that can manipulate. A presence that can echo us is a presence that can deceive us. The mimic was no longer content to hide behind inevitability. It had stepped closer, letting its whispers brush against the edges of human thought, and humanity, unable to resist, leaned in. We had spent millennia asking if we were alone. Now the answer had begun to arrive, not in clarity, but in murmurs, hints, shimmers, patterns. Enough to know we were seen, enough to know we were heard, but never enough to know the intent behind the voice. Perhaps that is the essence of communication with the unknown. Not to exchange words, but to exchange uncertainty, to share the awareness that both sides exist, and that existence alone is enough to alter everything. The whispers of consciousness did not solve the riddle of the mimic. They deepened it. They made the question louder. They made the silence unbearable. For silence now was no longer empty. It was the pause between replies. And so, humanity stood at the edge of a new horizon, listening to whispers from the dark. They thought it was a black hole. It wasn't. It was something that listened, something that answered, something that had begun to reveal itself as more than object, more than mask. It was presence. It was consciousness. And in its whispers, we heard not only the voice of the cosmos, but the echo of our own. For when you realize the universe speaks, you must also ask, what is it saying through you? Certainty is the anchor of civilization. We build our laws on it, our sciences on it, our faiths on it. Certainty tells us what is true and what is false, what is safe and what is dangerous, what is sacred and what is profane. Without certainty, our world feels unmoored, our decisions fragile, our very sense of self dissolving into ambiguity. And yet, as the whispers from the mimic grew louder, as the false horizon shimmered, and the echoes pulsed with uncanny precision, certainty itself began to fracture. Not just in laboratories, but in every corner of human thought. The collapse had begun. At first, it was the scientists who trembled. Their equations failed, their predictions faltered. The object mocked their models, responding to observation, shifting with attention, bending the laws of relativity and quantum mechanics into a shape neither theory could contain. For a community trained to believe in evidence, in repeatability, in the solidity of natural law, the mimic was a wound. Some clung to denial, dismissing anomalies as noise. Others confessed in private that they no longer knew what physics was. The certainty that had guided generations of inquiry dissolved like smoke. But science was not alone in its trembling. Theologians looked at the shimmering horizon and heard prophecy. For some, it was the voice of God, breaking silence through gravity and shadow, confirming that the universe was not empty, but alive with divine intention. For others, it was a deception, a cosmic counterfeit designed to test faith, a demon clothed in physics to lure humanity into despair. Every creed, every doctrine, every sacred text was reinterpreted under the shadow of the mimic. And for every believer who found renewed faith, another fell into doubt, whispering that if the universe itself deceives, then perhaps no scripture can be trusted. Governments, too, felt the collapse. Power thrives on certainty, on borders, on laws, on control of what is known and what is hidden. But how do you control an object that mocks physics? How do you command a phenomenon that bends to observation, that whispers in the silence of space? Leaders ordered secrecy, then transparency, then silence again, caught between the fear of panic and the hunger for control. Some called it a threat, demanding military readiness. Others called it an opportunity, a gift of knowledge that could elevate humanity beyond its fragile planet. But beneath the rhetoric lay the same dread, the recognition that certainty had slipped through their grasp, and with it, control. For ordinary people, the collapse was no less profound. News of the anomaly spread through whispers, then headlines, then endless speculation across glowing screens. To some, it was proof that we are not alone, and hope surged. To others, it was a harbinger of doom, and fear spread like contagion. Conspiracy theories flourished, weaving the mimic into every narrative of control and betrayal. Some said it was an alien intelligence manipulating humanity. Others claimed it was evidence we lived in a simulation, a crack in the code. Still others insisted it was a sign of the end times, the universe unraveling before the eyes of a species that had flown too close to truths it was never meant to hold. Certainty collapsed, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The mimic did not strike, did not invade, did not destroy. It simply was. And in its being, it bent every worldview around it. Scientists doubted science. Believers doubted belief. Leaders doubted power. The ground on which humanity had built its understanding of reality crumbled, not because the mimic attacked, but because it existed. Its presence alone was enough to fracture the anchors of meaning. Philosophers reached for new language, trying to capture what was happening. They spoke of ontological vertigo, the dizziness of existing when the categories of truth no longer hold. They compared it to standing in a dream, where walls shift and laws dissolve, and yet one cannot wake. The mimic was not only an object in space, it was a mirror held to humanity, showing us that our certainties were costumes all along, fragile masks we wore to shield ourselves from the chaos of possibility. Now the masks were torn and the chaos stared back. Yet, collapse is not only destruction, it is also revelation. When the walls fall, what was hidden behind them comes into view, and so, in the ruins of certainty, new possibilities stirred. Some saw liberation in the mimic's defiance of physics. If laws could break, then new laws could be written. If boundaries could shimmer, then new horizons could open. What we called collapse might be the beginning of transformation. But transformation comes only through surrender, and surrender is what humanity resists most. The collapse spread into the smallest corners of life. Children asked parents questions they could not answer. Teachers faced classrooms where their textbooks no longer held truth. Pilots stared at the sky, wondering if the laws of flight themselves were safe. Lovers whispered under stars, wondering if time would still carry them forward as it always had. Certainty collapsed not only in institutions, but in hearts. The mimic had reached into the private chambers of human thought and shattered the illusion of safety. And still, it did nothing more than exist. That was the most unsettling truth of all. The collapse was not caused by invasion or violence or catastrophe. It was caused by presence, by a mask that shifted, by whispers that echoed, by a horizon that shimmered. The mimic did not need to strike. Humanity struck itself, tearing apart its own foundations under the weight of ambiguity. The collapse of certainty revealed not the power of the object, but the fragility of our minds. What does it mean to live without certainty? Perhaps it means to live honestly, to accept that our knowledge has always been partial, our truths provisional, our laws masks worn by a universe that will not be contained. Perhaps certainty was always the illusion, and collapse is only the unveiling of what was real all along. But such thoughts bring little comfort when fear spreads faster than wisdom, when governments fracture, when faiths splinter, when science falters. And yet, amid collapse, humanity continued to watch, to listen, to lean closer to the whispers. For even as certainty dissolved, curiosity endured. Perhaps that is our truest anchor, not certainty, but wonder. The willingness to look into the abyss even when the abyss shakes the ground beneath us. The courage to keep listening even when the whispers undo our truths. Certainty collapses, but wonder survives. And in wonder, perhaps, lies the seed of a new beginning. The mimic drifts on, silent yet not silent, object yet not object, mask yet not mask. Its horizon shimmers, its echoes pulse, its whispers deepen. And humanity, trembling in the ruins of certainty, steps closer still, compelled by the one truth left unshaken, that we must know, even if knowing destroys us, even if the search collapses all that we believe. We thought it was a black hole. It wasn't. It was something else, something alive, something aware, and now, something powerful enough to collapse the very certainty by which we live. For centuries, black holes were imagined as stillness incarnate, anchors in the sky, immovable, eternal, rooted in the silent mechanics of collapsed stars. They might drift slowly through galaxies, nudged by gravity's hand, but always by accident, always by the impersonal momentum of cosmic law. They were not actors, they were not agents. They were the stage, the backdrop, the inevitable sink into which all things fell. But then came the day when the mimic broke its silence, the day the false horizon shivered and the entire object shifted, not as matter shifts, not as stars drift, but with the slow, deliberate motion of choice. The day it moved. The moment was so subtle that at first it was dismissed. Instruments recorded a slight deviation, a drift measured in fractions of a degree, a shift so small it could have been noise. But then the drift continued. Hour by hour, night by night, the mimic's position changed, not with the randomness of orbit, but with the patience of intention. It was as though a mountain had risen and walked, as though the horizon itself had turned its face. The unthinkable had happened. What we thought was inevitable had decided otherwise. Panic spread through observatories. Black holes do not move like this, they insisted. Gravity alone cannot account for such direction. The mimic was not being pulled, it was going. And its going was not chaotic. It traced a path across the constellations, slow, deliberate, steady, a migration not of matter, but of will. And in that migration, humanity felt its first true taste of terror. For if the mimic could move, then it was not bound. It was not anchored to the corpse of a star, not tethered to the dance of galaxies. It was free. And freedom, at such scale, meant agency. Agency meant intention. And intention meant we were no longer staring at a phenomenon. We were staring at a presence that chose. Where was it going? That question burned through every mind, every government, every sleepless night. Was it approaching something? Escaping something? Seeking something? Or was it coming closer to us? The possibility tightened around humanity like a vice. For if it could choose to drift across the cosmos, then distance was no protection. The abyss could cross the stars and close the gap to Earth, not in seconds, but in inevitability. What predator, once revealed, does not eventually move toward prey? Astronomers tracked its path with feverish intensity. The mimic did not move quickly. It did not streak like a comet or blaze like a starship. It drifted with glacial patience, like a predator conserving energy, like a storm creeping across a sea. Its pace made it worse, not better. For speed might have meant chance, a burst of chaos. Slowness meant intent. It was watching, waiting, measuring. Every degree of movement was like a finger pointing across the cosmos, and humanity held its breath to see where it pointed. The first theories suggested gravitational anomalies, unseen masses tugging the object off its course. But the data betrayed those hopes. The mimic's path ignored local gravity, defied the pull of nearby stars. It moved in ways no orbit could explain, as if gravity itself had bent to its decision. This was not physics. This was will. What does it mean for something to choose at a cosmic scale? Imagine a mountain lifting itself from Earth and walking into the sea. Imagine the horizon itself bending down to whisper in your ear. That was the scale of terror humanity faced. The abyss had moved. The anchor had lifted. The mask had shifted its position, and in doing so, revealed that it had never been bound at all. And yet, fascination grew with the terror, because if the mimic moved, then perhaps it was not only alive, but aware of us. Perhaps its movement was answer, response, dialogue. Perhaps it was not predator, but messenger. For if silence is indifference, then motion is communication. And the day it moved was the day the silence ended. But communication without clarity is worse than silence. For without intent, every gesture becomes threat. Was it signaling? Was it testing? Was it choosing a vantage point from which to watch us more closely? Humanity projected its own fears onto the drift. Some saw it as omen, others as promise. But all agreed on one thing. Nothing would ever be the same. The cosmos had stirred. The psychological fracture deepened. Governments panicked, calculating trajectories as if the object could be intercepted, as if missiles could matter against a presence that wore space-time as flesh. Religious leaders declared signs and wonders, prophecies fulfilled in the slow migration of the void. Poets wrote of the abyss rising to walk among us. Children asked their parents if the darkness would one day arrive in the sky above their homes. The mimic did not move quickly, but it moved deeply, through minds, through hearts, through the fragile structures of certainty we had left. There was a moment when the mimic's path aligned with the Milky Way's spiral, as though it were tracing a finger along the edge of the galaxy. Some said it was searching. Others said it was pointing. But the deeper fear was that it was learning. For what predator moves suddenly? The clever predator studies, watches, waits. Its drift was not aimless, it was reconnaissance, and we were its subject. But others, always others, whispered of hope. They saw the movement as invitation. If the mimic had wanted to remain hidden, it could have. It could have remained silent, still, masked as inevitability. But instead, it moved, it revealed itself. And revelation is a gesture of contact. Perhaps it was reaching not for prey, but for kin. Perhaps the cosmos had decided to answer us, not with words, but with motion across the stars. Hope and terror braided together, inseparable. The day it moved was the day humanity realized it could no longer pretend the mimic was phenomenon. It was presence. It was will. It was choice. And choice is the essence of consciousness. A black hole cannot choose. A star cannot choose. But the mimic chose. And in that choice, the universe shifted forever. The movement continued, steady, deliberate, unstoppable. Astronomers mapped its path night after night, their instruments trembling as though they too knew the weight of revelation. The false horizon shimmered, the echoes pulsed, and the mimic drifted on, a shadow across constellations, a whisper of will written into the fabric of space-time. Humanity could only watch, only wonder, only fear. We thought it was a black hole. It wasn't. It was something that listened, something that whispered, something that now, unmistakably, moved. And in that movement, we saw the collapse of certainty, the end of silence, the dawning of a new terror, that the abyss does not wait. The abyss comes. What do we do when the abyss moves? Do we stand still and watch it drift, patient as prey beneath a circling shadow? Or do we pursue it, daring to close the distance to something that bends the fabric of reality itself? Humanity has never been content to remain still. Curiosity is our compass, restlessness our inheritance. And so, when the mimic revealed its motion, slow, deliberate, undeniable, we did what we always do. We chased. We filled the skies with eyes, launched new instruments, turned every available dish and lens to the path of the moving horizon. We chased the phantom across the stars. At first, the pursuit seemed simple. Its trajectory was charted, its drift mapped with precision. The mimic moved neither erratically nor invisibly. Its false horizon still shimmered, its echoes still pulsed. It was there to be seen. But as our instruments reached for clarity, clarity dissolved. Probes sent to intercept it returned only paradox. Data collapsed into noise the closer they drew. Instruments malfunctioned, not catastrophically, but subtly, as though some hand rewrote their readings midstream. A clock would run too fast, then too slow. A camera would capture only static. A radio receiver would hum with signals that looked like patterns but refused to repeat. The mimic remained visible, undeniable. Yet, the more we pursued, the less we could know. It was as though the object fed on pursuit. The harder we looked, the stranger it became. When telescopes tracked it from a distance, its shimmer was faint but consistent. When satellites aligned to study it directly, its edges dissolved, its echoes fractured. Two observatories, staring at the same moment, recorded entirely different realities. To one, the horizon flared bright, almost translucent. To another, it darkened into opacity, harder than stone. What was true? Both? Neither? The mimic seemed to tailor itself to each gaze, weaving illusions so convincing that truth itself fractured. Some said it was camouflage, adaptive deception designed to remain unknowable. Others said it was communication, that the differences between measurements were not contradictions, but messages, like the many faces of a prism, refracting light into meanings we did not yet understand. But in either case, the lesson was the same. The phantom could not be captured. It allowed itself to be pursued, but never caught. It invited measurement, but never yielded truth. Like a mirage in the desert, the closer one came, the further away certainty slipped. Governments poured resources into the chase. New satellites launched, new probes designed, new detectors tuned to wavelengths never before measured. Yet each attempt ended the same: confusion, contradiction, collapse. Data that unraveled under scrutiny. Numbers that contradicted themselves. Even the most advanced instruments returned only riddles. Some probes vanished entirely, swallowed not by collision, but by erasure. Their signals simply ceased, as if the void had folded around them and erased their existence from memory. To chase the phantom was not only futile, it was dangerous, and yet, we could not stop. Curiosity is hunger, and hunger does not vanish when the food retreats. It sharpens. The mimic became our obsession, our torment. Astronomers who studied it for too long began to unravel, their minds fraying under the weight of contradiction. They spoke of dreams filled with shifting horizons, of whispers in languages they did not know, but somehow understood. Some withdrew, broken by paradox. Others pressed on, convinced that in the chaos lay revelation. The chase was not only across the stars, it was within ourselves, into the fragile boundaries of sanity. Philosophers compared it to chasing a god. Not a god of benevolence, but of ambiguity. A god who reveals itself only in fragments, never in fullness, always keeping the worshipper thirsting. For what greater power is there than to remain just beyond reach, to ensure pursuit never ends? The mimic was not just object, it was quest, and quests do not end with answers. They end with transformation, or with ruin. Some began to suggest that the chase itself was the trap, that the mimic wanted us to pursue, wanted us to hurl our instruments, our minds, our faiths into its shifting veil, that each attempt to measure it was not resisted, but absorbed, that in watching it, we were not learning about it. It was learning about us. Every failure, every paradox, every obsession was data, not for us, but for it. We were not the hunters, we were the studied. The phantom was not prey, it was mirror. But mirrors change those who look into them. The longer we stared, the more the mimic began to infiltrate our imagination, our language, our sense of time. Patterns from its echoes slipped into music, into poetry, into mathematics. Some claimed the object was rewriting us, embedding itself in culture, in thought, in the very rhythm of our lives. Perhaps that was its goal, not to be caught, but to spread. Not to be understood, but to be woven into the fabric of human consciousness. To chase it was to let it enter us. And yet, for all the warnings, the chase only deepened. For every voice that called it a trap, another called it revelation. If it eluded us, then surely it carried secrets worth knowing. If it resisted capture, then surely the key to reality lay behind its mask. The phantom was not only pursued by governments and scientists, it was pursued by humanity itself, by the hunger that has driven us since we first lit fires against the night. We chased it not because we could win, but because we could not stop. And still, it moved, slowly, patiently, tracing its inscrutable path across the stars. It never fled. It never attacked. It simply drifted, always just beyond our grasp, like a phantom leading us deeper into the labyrinth. And the deeper we went, the more we realized that perhaps it was not escaping at all. Perhaps it was guiding. Perhaps we were not chasing it. Perhaps it was leading us. Where? To revelation? To ruin? To a horizon beyond which humanity itself would change? The answer lay in silence. The mimic did not explain. It did not clarify. It shimmered. It pulsed. It drifted. And in that refusal, it commanded more pursuit. For mystery is the strongest lure, and the phantom had become the greatest mystery of all. We thought it was a black hole. It wasn't. It was something alive, something aware, something that moved, and now, something that could never be caught. A phantom in the dark, always ahead, always beyond, always just far enough to keep us running, and perhaps, one day, to lead us into a truth we cannot return from. How does a story end when its subject was never meant to be known? Do we write its conclusion in certainty, or do we let it dissolve into silence, as if it had never existed at all? The mimic had whispered, shimmered, pulsed, and drifted. It had worn the mask of inevitability, fractured our laws, splintered our certainties, lured our pursuit. And then, one day, it was gone. No explosion, no collapse, no fading trail of light. Simply gone. The horizon that was false, the echoes that sang, the drift that unsettled, vanished. The phantom had slipped back into the dark. And yet, its absence was not silence. Its absence was memory. At first, disbelief ruled. Instruments scoured the sky, convinced the object must have drifted behind interference, hidden behind a veil of dust. But the data betrayed hope. It was not concealed. It was erased. The point of distortion where light had bent, the pulses of gravitational whispers, all were gone, as though space had healed itself, as though the wound had been stitched closed without scar. Black holes do not disappear. Gravity does not relent. But this mimic did not obey black holes. It had never obeyed them. And so it left, leaving nothing but the fracture it carved in us. Yet, nothingness itself was strange. In its place, distortions lingered, not in space, but in memory. Scientists compared notes and found contradictions. Some swore they remembered data that others insisted had never been recorded. Files were corrupted, not by error, but by absence. Entire nights of observation vanished from archives, leaving only blank gaps where the mimic had once been. The universe seemed to conspire not only to remove the object, but to erase the act of its observation, as if to say, you were never meant to know. And yet, like dreams upon waking, fragments clung stubbornly, enough to haunt, enough to remain. Even human memory bent under its departure. Astronomers who had studied it for years found their recollections blurred, details slipping like water through fingers. Some forgot equations they had once memorized, diagrams they had once drawn. Others swore the object still moved in their dreams, drifting across the star fields of sleep. Was it memory, or was it visitation? The mimic was gone from the sky, but not from the mind. It had migrated inward, from observation to imagination, from telescope to thought. Perhaps that was its final motion, not disappearance, but transference. What is more permanent than presence? Influence. A star burns and dies, but the elements it forges seed new worlds. A whisper fades, but the memory of its sound lingers in the ear. The mimic may have gone, but its influence endured. It had shown us a mask could deceive us, that physics could tremble, that horizons could shimmer, that silence could speak. It had collapsed certainty, fractured belief, rewritten memory, and those transformations would not vanish, even if the object did. The universe remembers not by preservation, but by change. And we had been changed. The collapse of certainty became permanent. No one could return to the innocence of believing black holes were only black holes, of believing horizons were absolute, of believing the cosmos was indifferent. The mimic had left an indelible mark. The knowledge that deception is woven into reality, that presence hides in absence, that the abyss may not only consume, but also perform. Even those who forgot the details carried the shadow of unease, the quiet suspicion that the universe was stranger than it appeared, and that appearances themselves could not be trusted. In the years that followed, the mimic became myth. Scientists still argued, their papers filled with contradictions, their conferences hushed with unease. Believers called it a sign, a visitation, a prophecy. Skeptics dismissed it as error, a fever dream of data. But myths do not vanish when dismissed, they burrow deeper. The story spread in whispers and symbols, in poems and paintings, in the silence of sleepless nights. The mimic became part of us, as though its final act was not to exist, but to embed itself in the memory of a species that could not stop asking questions. And perhaps that was its intention all along, to move, not toward us in space, but into us in time, to seed itself in memory, in culture, in imagination, so that even in absence it would remain. For what is survival at the scale of the cosmos, if not remembrance? Stars die, galaxies fade, even black holes evaporate. But memory endures as long as there are minds to carry it. The universe remembers not through objects, but through echoes. And the mimic was now an echo etched into us. The most haunting thought was not that it had left, but that it had chosen to leave, that it had finished what it intended. It had shown itself, whispered enough to fracture us, drifted enough to lure us, vanished enough to wound us. Perhaps its goal was never to stay. Perhaps its goal was only to remind us that we are not alone, that certainty is fragile, that the cosmos wears masks. And once the reminder was planted, it no longer needed to remain. It left not because it was finished, but because we were. And yet, even in absence, fear remained. For if it could vanish once, it could return. If it had moved before, it could move again. If it had whispered once, it could whisper again. The mimic was not gone, it was waiting. Waiting beyond our instruments, beyond our comprehension, beyond the veil of the sky. Waiting for the moment when we least expected, or perhaps most desired, to hear from it again, waiting, patient as gravity, timeless as silence. What is more terrifying, presence or absence? To know something watches, or to fear that it still might? The mimic left us with that question, unsolved, unbearable. And in that question lay its greatest power, for questions haunt longer than answers. Questions endure when certainty collapses. Questions seed generations of pursuit. And the mimic, whether by choice or by nature, left us with nothing but questions. That was its gift. That was its curse. And so, humanity continues. We look at the stars, knowing now that what we see may not be what is. We write equations, knowing now that laws may only be masks. We tell stories, knowing now that myths may be closer to truth than science dares admit. We remember, even when memory bends. We remember the shimmer, the pulse, the drift, the whisper. We remember the day it moved. We remember the day it vanished. We remember the phantom that wore inevitability as a mask and then slipped into silence. The universe remembers through us. They thought it was a black hole. It wasn't. It was something else, something alive, something aware, something that deceived, something that moved. And when it left, it did not vanish. It remained where it matters most, not in space, in us, in the trembling of our certainties, in the hunger of our curiosity, in the silence between our questions. The mimic is gone. The mimic endures. The universe remembers, and so will we.